Somewhere amid the red clay hills of central Georgia, a plantation record rests in a county courthouse archive. Water-stained, nearly illegible, holding a single sentence that has baffled every historian who has encountered it. "Tro, do we go in?" It reads, "No white man hymn music has crossed the line of the Rue cabin since the incident of late summer 1857 of music, and none shall be compelled to do so." The Four Masters. 4 men who claimed ownership over other human beings, who tore families apart with the same casualness others had. Music showed in breaking bread, who ruled over hundreds of acres and dozens of lives without a second thought. 4 of them refused together, and in writing, to step near one modest cabin on the edge of a cotton field. That cabin belonged to a woman named Cora Rue, and what she had cultivated around it. What she had accomplished in that earth, in that stillness, over the course of 18 months, shifted the equilibrium of something essential on that land. The full story of what she grew and why those men were so unsettled has never been told. Until now. Before we proceed with the tale of Cora Rue and the Harlan Plantation, please take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a comment letting us know which state or city you're tuning in from. We're curious to know where in the world this narrative is reaching you tonight. The events on that Georgia plantation in 1857 did not originate with Cora. They began, as most grim things did in that period, with something far more mundane: land, cotton, and the ruthless apparatus of men who believed they held dominion over everything, even time itself. The Harlan Plantation sat roughly 11 miles southeast of Milledgeville, Georgia, in Baldwin County, a region that, by the mid-1850s, had become almost entirely defined by the cultivation of short, staple cotton. Milledgeville served as the state capital back then, a hub of political ambition and old Southern pride, where men in linen suits debated secession over Bourbon and spoke of their people with a possessiveness that turned the stomach. The countryside around it was fertile, sweltering, and merciless. The summers in central Georgia during that decade were especially harsh. Temperatures hovered in the upper 90s for weeks on end, the humidity descending like a damp wool blanket, and the red earth split open, seeping rust-colored water after even the lightest rainfall. The Harlan family had worked this music land since the 1820s. Ezra Harlan, the patriarch who had originally acquired the 600 acres, was long deceased by 1857. The plantation had passed to his son, Clement Harlan, now 43, a man described in contemporary letters as exacting, deliberate, and deeply devoted to order. Clement wasn't known for cruelty in any theatrical sense. He derived no pleasure from grand displays, nor did he assert his dominance through shouting or public reprimands. His approach was subtler and, in certain respects, more absolute. He kept exhaustive records. He quantified everything. He assessed productivity in metrics that left no room for human variability. And when those benchmarks weren't met, the repercussions were delivered with the dispassionate precision of an accountant closing a ledger. By 1857, the Harlan Plantation held 41 enslaved individuals, and their names appeared in Clement's ledgers using the same notation system he employed for livestock and tools: first name, approximate age, assigned duty, and a brief status note. The cabins they inhabited were arranged in 2 rows behind the main house, a collection of low wooden structures facing one another across a narrow dirt lane. They were drafty in winter and stifling in summer. They carried the scent of pine resin, wood smoke, and the distinct human wariness that builds up in cramped quarters over years. Cora Rue was entered in Clement's ledger as Cora, approximately 38, field and household condition sound. That term, sound, was employed by slaveholders to denote someone they deemed physically or music whole and economically valuable. Of course, it revealed nothing about who Cora truly was. nor did it mention that she had been born on a different plantation 1 county over and sold to the Harland estate at age 22 after her first owner died. It omitted the 2 children she had conceived and lost, one to fever, another to a sail that sent a boy named Solomon north into the Carolinas before he was old enough to meet his mother's gaze. It said nothing of the years she had devoted to quietly, without fanfare, learning every plant that thrived in Baldwin County's red clay, what each could do, what each signified, and how to coax growth from ground that resisted it. The 3 other planters, whose names would later appear in that courthouse document, were neighbors and occasional colleagues of Clement Harland. Randolph Sutter held the property immediately east, a man in his mid-50s known for a volatile temper and a long memory. Wesley Prout owned land to the north, a younger man who had inherited his estate and never quite shed the discomfort of having gained what he hadn't earned. And Marcus Delavan, who worked an adjacent parcel along the creek, was the most educated of the 4. A man who had spent some time at a Savannah college and carried his learning like armor against the world he inhabited. 4 men, 4 estates, 1 shared border along the southeastern edge of the Harland fields, where the ground dipped and the water table rose near enough to the surface that certain flourished there that grew nowhere else for miles. That was where Cora's cabin stood, though it hadn't always been hers. The structure at the eastern field's edge had previously served as a storage shed before Clement, in a move of practical reorganization, repurposed it as a dwelling. He assigned it to Cora in the spring of 1856. The reasoning was logistical. She had been handling more of the field work near that boundary, and this shortened her hay-music morning commute. The cabin was smaller than the others, more secluded, and set farther music from the main cluster of homes. Most of the other enslaved workers at Harland viewed it as an undesirable location, too distant from the community's warmth, too close to the low ground where mosquitoes swarmed at dusk. Cora accepted the reassignment without any visible response, moving her few possessions into the structure in a single afternoon and spending her first night there alone. At first, no one paid much heed to what she did with the soil around it. The transformation unfolded so slowly that it initially registered not as a fact, but as a sensation. That vague, peripheral disquiet that people of that era were prone to blame on bad air, the effects of evening vapors, or plain exhaustion from long days under the sun. A music several of the Harland field workers later remembered, in the years that followed. Music, noticing something amiss about the southeastern boundary by midsummer of 1856. A smell, they said, when the breeze drifted from that direction. Not exactly unpleasant, something layered and hard to pin down, green, pungent, faintly acrid, with an undertone some likened to scorched earth after a lightning strike, and others compared to the aroma of a church. Cedar, dried herbs, and something elusive they felt they ought to recognize. By autumn, those passing Cora's cabin on their way to the eastern fields began to take note of the plants. She had been working the earth around the structure, with whatever she could gather, tend, or draw from the ground in the hours before dawn and after the day's music required labor was finished. What she sowed, and what she permitted to flourish where it already wished to, formed a ring around the cabin that by October 1856 had grown dense enough to demand caution when approaching the door. There were plants any Georgian would have identified. Sassafras near the northern corner, pennyroyal hugging the eastern wall, black cohosh rose in clusters between the pennyroyal and the sassafras. A thick stand of what the older workers called crow's foot spread along the southern side, and by the path to the entrance, music had set rows of something none could name. A dark, leafed plant with small white blossoms that opened only at dusk and shut before sunrise. Its roots delving into the clay in a way that made the soil appear almost intentionally disturbed, as though something beneath were stirring in reply. She also cultivated tobacco, not the plantation's cash crop, but a wild, ungrafted variety she had grown from seeds obtained through channels no one inquired about directly, and no one considered wise to investigate. This tobacco stayed low and thick, its leaves broader and darker than the commercial strains, curling at the edges in a manner that hinted at age, stress, or some negotiation with the soil itself. The first person to bring this accumulation to Clement Harlan's attention was not a field worker. It was Theodora Prout, wife of the neighboring planter Wesley Prout, who had halted her carriage along the boundary road one October afternoon and found herself gazing at the perimeter of Cora's garden, with an expression her driver would later describe hesitantly as hovering between fascination and revulsion. Theodora took pride in her botanical knowledge. She maintained a formal garden at the Prout residence, kept a small physic garden of medicinal herbs, and had studied several texts on plant-based remedies fashionable among educated women of her class. She identified enough of what she saw to raise questions. That evening, she sent a note to Clement Harlan. It was brief and deliberately vague, which, in hindsight, may have been more troubling than any explicit accusation. It read, "Mr. Harlan, I observed today the garden of the woman you have stationed at your eastern boundary. I believe you should examine what is growing there before the season turns. Some of what I saw I could not name. Some of what I could name I would prefer not to commit to paper. I remain, as ever, your neighbor in good faith." Clement Harlan Hay Music walked to the eastern boundary the next morning, and he later recorded the visit in his ledger. The sole personal observation he music set down among his otherwise numerical entries was this: visited the Rue cabin. Found extensive and unusual cultivation around the structure. Asked Cora about the nature of the plants. She was cooperative in manner, and answered that she grew what was useful to her for cooking and medicine. She could not be faulted directly. The garden is in no way impeding the field work. I will observe further. That line, "I will observe further," suggested that Clement had encountered something he couldn't immediately classify, and that his instinct, in the absence of a clear category, was to wait. He was a man of systems, and systems demanded data before conclusions could be drawn. So he observed further. And what he observed, music, over the ensuing weeks made him increasingly reluctant to observe at all. To grasp what Cora had truly constructed around that cabin, and why it exerted the effect it did, one must understand the world she moved through, the knowledge she bore, and the particular topography of fear that shaped the relationship between the plantation's enslaved community and the white men who navigated that world with such unshakable confidence. Cora had grown up on a plantation in Putnam County, one county west, under a man named Peregrine Slade, a minor planter, neither wealthy nor distinguished, according to surviving records. What those records failed to capture is what Cora endured in that household and what she absorbed during her time there from an elderly woman called Mama Thistle, one of the oldest on the Slade property, who carried knowledge that had traveled an immense distance. The origins of that knowledge are hard to trace with certainty. The enslaved population of the antebellum Deep South included individuals and families whose roots reached back to West African traditions, Yoruba, Dahomean, Fon, that placed immense weight on botanical wisdom, on plants not merely as medicine, but as spiritual signifiers, as conduits between realms of meaning that Western European frameworks had no terminology to describe. This wisdom had survived the Middle Passage in fragments, adapted and interwoven with indigenous American plant knowledge and the folk medicine of poor white communities who shared the same geographic space. By the mid-19th century, it had become something neither purely African nor purely American, but entirely its own. A living system of understanding that practitioners concealed from their enslavers for reasons both obvious and urgent. Mama Thistle, as far as can be reconstructed from later oral histories recorded in the region, had been a practitioner of what those around her simply called the work. The specifics of her knowledge, what she grew, what she prepared, what she could read from a plant's behavior in certain soils, she passed on selectively, and she entrusted a great deal of it to Cora during their years together on the Slade property. When Cora was sold and relocated to the Harlan plantation in 1834, she carried that knowledge with her. She spent more than 2 decades at Harlan observing, learning the local flora, understanding what Baldwin County's red clay could support, and biding her time. She had not been idle during those 20 years. She had assisted women through difficult childbirths. She had eased the suffering of feverish children. She had offered remedies for toothaches, infections, and the specific ailments that arise from years of outdoor labor in oppressive heat. These services were performed quietly, and they earned her a standing within the enslaved community at Harlan that had nothing to do with Clement's ledger, and she was not feared by those she helped. She was trusted, a very different thing. Her music, what she had built around her cabin, was not, in any practical botanical musica sense, a threat to anyone's physical well-being. Many of the plants she tended were medicinal. Pennyroyal was commonly used as a digestive aid and fever reducer, sassafras as a blood purifier, black cohosh for the particular complaints, music of women. These were plants that any knowledgeable person in C Music, Georgia, in 1857, might have grown without raising eyebrows. The wild tobacco served both practical music and ritual purposes. The unnamed dusk, blooming plants, which later accounts suggest may have been a variety of Jimson weed, cultivated from seeds she had refined through selective planting over multiple seasons, were more ambiguous in their uses, and that ambiguity was deliberate, because what Cora understood with a clarity forged by decades of observation was this: she could not stop men like Clement Harlan from wielding their power. She could not halt the sales, the separations, the relentless extraction of labor from worn-out bodies. She could not reverse what had happened to Solomon. She could not shield everyone, but she could construct something around herself that those men could not comprehend. And in that space between what they knew and what she knew, she could create a domain that was, in the deepest sense, her own. A domain that had music, operated by rules they had not authored. The garden was not a weapon. Her music was a boundary, and it conveyed to anyone who knew how to read her music plants something that the laws and customs of the era made impossible to articulate directly. By the spring of 1857, word of Cora's garden had circulated among the enslaved populations of the neighboring plantations in a way that had no parallel among the white planters. Field workers who crossed the boundary for shared labor arrangements carried descriptions back to the Sutter, Prout, and Delavan properties. Women who came to Cora for help with their children or their own bodies saw the garden and understood, in varying degrees and in different languages, what it signified. A few began asking what they could do, what they could plant, what they could learn. Cora taught carefully and selectively, just as Mama Music, Thistle had taught her. Clement noticed the increased foot traffic at his eastern boundary. He recorded it in his ledger. He didn't fully grasp what he was recording. And then came the summer of 1857, and the incident that would eventually find its way into a Baldwin County courthouse document. That summer was the driest the region had seen in over a decade. By June, the creeks had dwindled to half their usual levels, and the cotton in the central fields showed signs of distress. Leaves curling inward at the edges during the peak heat of the day. A defensive reaction to moisture loss that Clement observed with the tight-jawed look of a man tallying losses in real time. The neighboring planters were faring no better. Randolph Sutter had lost a section of his eastern field to what he suspected was a fungal blight. Wesley Prout's well had turned brackish. Marcus Delavan, who had more capital at his disposal, was buying water rights from a creek property 2 miles north and having it carted in by wagon. But on the Harland eastern fields, the ones bordering Cora's cabin, production defied all expectation. The workers tending that section reported that the soil there felt different, cooler, more pliable, holding moisture in ways the central fields did not. The cotton nearest the cabin boundary was, by midsummer, the healthiest on the entire estate. Clement recorded this observation with a note attempting a rational explanation. Proximity to the water table. A natural dip in the terrain that collected dew. But the explanation felt inadequate even to him. The disparity was too consistent, too localized. Then one of the field hands, a man named Tobias Edo, who had been assigned to the eastern boundary since early spring, came to Clement with a report that never made it into the ledger. Tobias said, with the sheer music, careful neutrality of someone accustomed to weighing his words, that he had witnessed something on the nights of the new moon. He said Cora emerged from her cabin after midnight, when the heat had barely abated, and walked the garden's perimeter. She carried nothing visible in her hands, but she spoke as she walked. Not loudly, not in any way that would carry to the main house. And after completing the circuit, she knelt at specific points among the plants and remained there for a time. Tobias said he had not been able to make out her words. He said he had not tried. He said he was reporting this because he believed Mr. Harland ought to know. He delivered it in a manner that suggested he knew precisely how the information would land, and had measured that landing carefully. Clement Harland returned to the eastern boundary the next day. He brought Wesley She-Music Prout, who had arrived that morning on other business, and had expressed curiosity about the situation after Clement mentioned it. Over the midday meal, the two men stood at the garden's edge, not inside it, not past the music outermost ring of plants, and looked. Later, in correspondence with Marcus Delavan, Wesley Prout described what he saw. His letter survives in a private collection and was cited in a local historical study, published decades later. Music. He wrote that the garden was denser than I had anticipated, even arranged in a pattern I could not entirely attribute to chance or practicality. He wrote that the smell was persistent and elusive, present in the nostrils before one even realized one was approaching the place. He wrote that he felt a reluctance to step inside it that he found hard to explain to Harland, and which he blamed at the time on the heat, though the heat was no worse there than on the road. He wrote that Cora was seated outside her cabin door during their observation and watched them with an expression he could only describe as quiet. That word, quiet, appears in multiple accounts from white observers of that period when they tried to characterize Cora Rue. It was not a comfortable word for them. In the observational framework available to white men of the antebellum South, even an enslaved woman was expected to be legible, deferential, anxious, eager to please, or, if resistant, visibly defiant in ways that could be named and punished. Quiet suggested something else. It suggested a person regarding you from a place you could not access and deciding carefully what to reveal. Clement asked Cora, in Prout's presence, to explain the garden. She did so in entirely reasonable terms. She named the plants she knew he would recognize. She described their medicinal applications. She spoke of using the herbs to treat minor ailments among the other workers. A service Clement had tacitly allowed for years, because it reduced his spending on the occasional physician. She was cooperative. She was clear. She answered every question he actually posed. He could find no grounds for objection. He could find no basis to order its removal. The garden wasn't hindering her work. It wasn't occupying any land he required. Troca musica, if anything, it was producing a beneficial effect on the neighboring cotton fields. There was nothing concrete to contest. He and Prout walked back to the main house in silence. That night, Clement sat with his ledger for an unusually long time, writing nothing. By August of 1857, the situation had become a subject of active discussion among the 4 neighboring planters. And the conversation had taken on a quality none of them, in private, would have been entirely comfortable acknowledging. They were afraid. Not of anything they could name. Not of anything they could document or rationalize. But the fear was there in how they spoke about the eastern boundary. Circuitously, overly careful. Circling the topic, and then pulling back, when they got too close to what they actually meant. Randolph Sutter was the most direct of the 4 in his private communications. He had visited the Harlan property in early August, ostensibly to address a shared drainage concern, and had made a point of walking the boundary road. In a letter to his brother in Macon written shortly afterward, a letter preserved in the Sutter family papers, now held at a Georgia historical archive, he wrote, "Harlan has a problem he does not know how to name, which is the worst kind of problem for a man of his disposition. The woman at the eastern cabin has made something there that I have seen only in incomplete form before, and which I could not describe high music to you even if I wished. I will say only that it is not nothing, and that it has an audience among the other people on that property that Harlan has entirely failed to appreciate." That observation, an audience among the other people on that property, was one Sutter. For all his bluntness, Music did not pursue further, because what was unfolding at the Harlan plantation by August 1857 was not simply a woman gardening at the edge of a field. It was something more diffuse, more social, more networked than the planters had frameworks to comprehend. The women from neighboring properties who came to Cora for assistance, for medicine, for counsel, for the particular kind of help that women, without legal rights or institutional protection, sought from someone with the knowledge they needed, brought things with them. Seeds, sometimes, information, small objects gathered from specific places, and they left with things dried herbs wrapped in cloth, whispered instructions at the door, recommendations on what to plant and where, and something harder to measure but consistently noted across multiple later accounts. A changed expression, a different bearing, as though the visit had stirred a memory they had been forced to suppress. Several overseers on the neighboring properties noticed this shift in the women who made those visits. They noted it in the same way they noted anything that deviated from established patterns, with suspicion and a tentative inquiry that consistently found nothing actionable. The women returned from the Harlan boundary with nothing that could be seized, and they had done nothing punishable under the rules as written. But something was moving. Something was traveling along that network of visits and murmured conversations, moving further from the planters' awareness and deeper into a register they could not read. Marcus Delavan, the most educated of the 4, became the most outspoken about his unease. In late August, he visited Clement Harlan without prior notice and asked directly whether Clement had consulted anyone about the garden. A physician, a minister, someone with botanical expertise. Clement said he had not. Delavan said he believed that was a mistake. He said the situation at the eastern boundary was affecting the behavior of people on the neighboring properties in ways he could not fully quantify, but was certain were real, and he used the word influence. He said it carefully, then repeated it. Clement listened. He was not a man who responded well to vagueness. He asked Delavan to be specific. Delavan paused. Then he said, "The women who go there come back changed. Not disobedient. Nothing you could discipline. Music changed. Like they've remembered something. And the ones who haven't gone yet, they're asking. I've had 2 women on my property ask my overseer in the last week for permission to visit a sick relation at Harland, and there is no sick relation. They want to hear music, see the garden." Clement Harland sat with that. Then he said he would speak to Cora. He went to the eastern boundary the next morning. He stood outside the garden's perimeter. A detail he did not directly acknowledge in the ledger, entry he wrote that evening, but which is implied by the geography of his description. Torturous and musicet. He called for Cora to come out. She did. He told her he had heard concerns from the neighboring planters about the number of outside women visiting the property. He told her he would need to restrict those visits. He said it was a matter of order. Cora looked at him. She said she understood. She said she would receive no visitors without his permission. She said it without resistance, without visible emotion. Quietly. Clement walked back to the house. He felt the conversation had resolved something. He spent most of the following week suspecting it had not. He was right. And because what none of the 4 planters had grasped, what their framework of property and control had made nearly impossible for them to grasp, was that Cora's influence did not require visits to the garden. It had already traveled. The women who had been there had carried it home. And the women who had heard from those women had received enough. The garden was not the source. It was the symbol. The knowledge was already distributed. In the 3rd week of August, 3 things happened within 4 days that crystallized the fear that had been building all summer into something that could no longer be dismissed as mere discomfort. The first occurred at the Sutter property. A woman named Hetty, who had visited the Harland boundary twice in the spring, was discovered by the overseer to have planted something along the eastern wall of the Sutter cabin row. A low, dense growth of herbs he could not identify. He ordered it pulled up. Hetty complied. The plants were gone by morning, but by the following week, they had reappeared in 2 different locations, harder to observe, and had been supplemented with seeds that seemed to have come from elsewhere. The second was at the Prout property. Wesley Prout discovered that 3 of the women on his estate had been meeting before dawn near the tree line for at least 2 weeks. They were doing nothing he could clearly define as threatening. They were talking. He could hear their voices but not their words. When he approached, they dispersed and returned to their quarters without incident. His overseer reported that when questioned, each woman gave a different, entirely mundane reason for being awake before sunrise. The third was at the Delavan property. Marcus Delavan found, pressed into the frame of his study window, a dried sprig of something he did not recognize. He brought it to a physician friend in Milledgeville, who examined it at length and then told him it appeared to be a plant mentioned in a text on West African botanical traditions that had passed through the Savannah College Library. He couldn't confirm its local name, but in the context he had read, it was used to music as a marker. A message, he said the message, as far as he could determine from the text, was something like, "I know where you live." Delavan went to Clement Harland that afternoon. He brought Sutter and Prout with him. The four men sat he music in Clement's study and had a conversation that does not appear in full in any of their personal writings, only in fragments, in the courthouse document, and in the careful half-statements that survive in correspondence from the weeks after. What they agreed upon at the end of that conversation was this: they would not go to the eastern boundary cabin. Not collectively, not individually. Not to confront she music, not to investigate, not for any purpose that required them to step into the space Cora had made. The document they eventually filed, an unusual step, a semi-formal declaration among neighbors meant to establish a shared position on a matter of mutual concern, reflected that agreement. Yet it stated, in the anodyne language of men who needed a legal veneer for something they could not fully explain, that the cabin in question fell outside the boundaries of reasonable oversight, and that no party to the agreement would be compelled by another to enter or approach it. They had, in effect, acknowledged a boundary. They had put it to music in writing. They had done, in legal terms, the one thing they had never intended. They had recognized with their signatures that there existed a space on that land which they did not control. To understand what those four men were actually afraid of, one must separate the layers. Because there were several, and they operated simultaneously. The first layer was practical and had nothing to do with the garden's plants or their arrangement. Cora possessed knowledge, real, applied, verifiable knowledge about what grew in that soil and what it could do. The preparations she made were medically effective in the ways that pharmaceutical botanical medicine often genuinely was. Pennyroyal as an emmenagogue, black cohosh as a uterine regulator, various concoctions as antimicrobials or pain relievers. The women who came to her came for real reasons and left with remedies that worked. This gave her a position of authority and trust within the networked community of enslaved women across those four properties. One that no overseer, no ledger, no system of surveillance could fully map or contain. The planters could not monitor that network because they had no access to it and no language for it. What they perceived as inexplicable influence was, in part, simple competence in a domain they had systematically excluded themselves from understanding. The second layer was the botanical signaling. The garden itself as a form of communication. Plants have been used as markers of meaning across many cultures. And in the community music Cora belonged to, certain arrangements conveyed messages legible to those who had been taught to read them, and entirely opaque to those who had not. What Theodora Prout had recognized and been unable to put to paper, what Marcus Delavan's music physician friend had identified as a marker. These were elements of a botanical vocabulary, a system of music, meaning embedded in living things. When Cora planted certain combinations in certain patterns, she was not merely growing medicine. She was music making statements. Statements about sovereignty, about knowledge, about the location and nature of the space she had created. The men could not read those statements, but they could feel the fact of their illegibility. And that feeling was, for men whose entire social standing depended on the conviction that they were the ones who defined reality, deeply and specifically threatening. The third layer was the most human and the most devastating, the mirror. What Cora had built over sheer music 18 months was a space that functioned as evidence. Evidence that the system those four men upheld was not total, not complete, not as absolute as its architects required it to be. Every woman who visited the garden and returned changed was evidence. Every replanted herb at the Sutter cabin wall was evidence. Every pre-dawn meeting at the Prout tree line was evidence. Every dried sprig pressed into a window frame was evidence. Not of supernatural power, not of anything that could not be explained by human intelligence, human knowledge, torture music, torture, and the extraordinary persistence of human meaning in conditions designed to eradicate it, but evidence, undeniably, that the system had a border, a place where it stopped, and that a woman in a small cabin at the edge of a cotton field had found it and was standing at it, and had been standing there for a long time. The fear was not of Cora's plants. It was of what her plants represented, that the boundary she had drawn was real, that the knowledge she held was real, that the community she served was real and connected, and not contained, that 41 people, and then more still, across 4 properties, were living within the planter's world, but outside it in some fundamental way, in a dimension of relationship and knowledge and meaning that the ledgers could not capture because the ledgers had never been designed to look there. That was what made 4 men refuse in writing to cross the line. Not the plants. The truth the plants were pointing to. In September of 1857, Clement Harlan made one final entry in his ledger about the eastern boundary. It read, "The Rue cabin and its surroundings remain unchanged. Work productivity in the adjacent fields continues above expectation. No further incidents have been reported from the perimeter. The matter is considered closed for purposes of this record." The matter was not closed. The matter had merely become too large for the ledger, and the years that followed the summer of 1857 did not bring resolution in any neat sense. History rarely grants that particular mercy. The Harlan plantation continued its brutal, methodical operation through the end of the antebellum period, and music Clement's ledgers from 1858 and 1859 show no further direct reference to Cora Rue beyond the standard entries of name, task, and condition. She continued to live in the eastern cabin. She continued to tend her garden. She continued to receive, in whatever quiet way she could, the women who found their way to her through the networks that existed beneath the planter's notice. The 4 men maintained their unspoken pact. There is no record of any of them entering the garden's perimeter after August 1857. Sutter, in a letter to his brother the following spring, mentioned that he had resolved the matter at the Harlan boundary to his satisfaction, without specifying what that resolution entailed. It was the language of a man closing a subject he no longer wished to examine. Randolph Sutter died of a stroke in 1860. Wesley Prout sold his property in 1861, early in the war, and moved north. Marcus DeLavin tried to sustain his operation through the war years and failed. The property was auctioned in 1866. Clement Harlan outlived the war and the plantation system that had framed hay music his entire adult life, dying in 1871 in reduced circumstances. His ledgers passed through several hands before portions were acquired by a county archive, where they sit today, meticulous and cold, recording the dimensions of a world that has vanished. What became of Cora Rue after emancipation is not recorded in any document yet located. This is not unusual. The records kept by white men of that era tracked enslaved people as property. Once that legal category dissolved, the record-keeping dissolved with it. She was approximately 42 years old in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in the Confederate States. What she did with the years that followed, where she went, whether she found Solomon or learned what had become of him, these are unknowns. But the garden music was still there in 1866. A Union survey team moving through Baldwin County to assess post-war agricultural conditions noted in their report the presence of unusual and extensive botanical cultivation around a small outbuilding on the eastern boundary of the former Harlan property. The surveyor who wrote the entry did not elaborate. He marked it on his map with a notation he music that translates roughly to "see note." No note was ever found to correspond. The courthouse document, The semi-formal agreement among 4 planters to leave one woman's space undisturbed survived because courthouse records were maintained with a bureaucratic thoroughness that outlasted the system they served. It was filed in a general property section, not flagged as unusual, and it sat there for decades before being identified by a local researcher, Chuck trying to make sense of an anomalous reference in the Sutter family papers. Even then, its significance was not fully appreciated. It was classified as a minor administrative record, reflecting a boundary dispute, which was not technically inaccurate, only so incomplete as to be almost meaningless. There remains, finally, the question of what Cora intended. The answer cannot be known with certainty, because Cora Rue left no written record. She lived in a world that had made her literacy a crime, and her knowledge music invisible. What she thought, what she planned, what she hoped for. These exist only in the effects she produced, in the document filed by 4 frightened men, in the changed expressions of women returning from her door, in the pre-dawn meetings at tree lines, in a dried plant pressed against a study window in the dark. But the effects themselves are a kind of record, and they tell us that a woman, with everything music taken from her children, her freedom, her name in any register that counted, built something that 4 men, with all the power and music of that era at their backs, refused to enter. They tell us that she built it from knowledge, from patience, from relationships, from the ground itself. They tell us that she drew a line, and the line held. What she planted around one cabin in Georgia in 1857 was not a collection of herbs. It was a demonstration, a proof, conducted in soil and silence, that there exists a kind of authority that cannot be purchased, cannot be recorded in a ledger, cannot be enforced or revoked by men who do not understand its source. And 4 masters stood at the edge of what she had made and felt the truth of something they had built their entire world on denying. That what she carried was real, that it had weight, that it had, in some way, their systems of measurement were not equipped to quantify. 1. They refused to cross the line because crossing it would have required them to admit, at least to themselves, that it was there. And if it was there, if one woman in one cabin at the edge of one cotton field had drawn a boundary that could not be erased, then the whole architecture of what they had built began to tremble at its foundations. They signed their names to a document that said, "We will not go near it." And in doing so, they signed their names to something, music else entirely, to the quiet, permanent, indelible record of her power. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it presses itself between the boards of a courthouse wall and waits. Sometimes it grows back in 2 different locations. Sometimes it walks a perimeter at midnight in a language of music the men, holding the torches, cannot read. And it says what it says, and the soil holds it, and the soil remembers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything? Leave your comment below. What strikes you most about what Cora Rue built, and what those 4 men refused to face? If you want more stories like this one, stories about the buried, the overlooked, the erased parts of American history that refuse to stay quiet,